I want you to stop for a second and think about this. For the vast majority of human history, singing was not a special skill but a natural, common behavior, just like speaking or breathing. And in traditional societies, almost everyone sang in their daily lives, from working, during rituals, to lulling children to sleep. But then something began to change that we didn't really notice, especially starting from the early 20th century, when radio appeared in the 1920s and then television in the 1950s. We gradually shifted from creating our own sounds to sitting still and listening to others create them. And more people spent hours every day listening to music, but rarely sang themselves. So the real question is, what happens when a biological behavior that has existed for tens of thousands of years is reduced in just a few decades? Because evolution cannot keep up with that speed of change, and that means your body may still be expecting something that you almost no longer do. And if you want to understand this seriously, you cannot start from emotional culture. You have to start from what the body is actually doing at the most basic level. So instead of thinking about singing as a familiar activity, I want you to set all of that meaning aside for a moment and look at it the way a physicist would, as a specific physical process happening in real time. Because every time you produce a sound, what is really happening is that air from your lungs is being pushed out with a small but steady pressure, usually in the range of 5 to 10 centimeters H-core. That airflow moves upward through the larynx, where there are two bands of soft tissue we call the vocal folds, each about 15 to 20 millimeter long. They don't open fully, but form a very narrow slit called the glottis. And it is right at this narrow slit that the physics starts to get interesting, because when air is forced through such a narrow space, its velocity increases significantly. And according to Bernoulli's principle, when velocity increases, pressure decreases. This creates a suction force that pulls the two vocal folds back together after they have been pushed apart by the initial airflow. Then, as soon as they close, the pressure below builds up again and pushes them open once more. So you have a repeating cycle, open, close, open, close. And this cycle is not slow. It happens about 100 times per second for low voices and can exceed 1,000 times per second for high voices. That means every second you're producing hundreds, even thousands of separate pressure pulses. Each of these pulses propagates outward as a sound wave. But what is remarkable is that your ear does not perceive each individual pulse. Instead, it integrates all of them into a continuous signal. That is why you hear a steady musical note instead of a series of jerks. So if you look at its true nature, sound is not a continuous flow, but a series of extremely rapid collisions and pressure oscillations. And when you sing, you are not just producing sound in the ordinary sense. You are operating a complete mechanical oscillation system with an energy source, an oscillating element, and a wave-transmitting medium, just like an oscillator in physics, except that it is located right inside your body and operates continuously, almost without you being aware of it. So what does that flow of energy do to a living biological system where everything responds to physical stimuli? And it is at this point that the picture begins to expand beyond the scope of pure physics, because the oscillations you create do not stop at simple motion. They begin to interact with the complex biological environment inside the body, where molecules, cells, and systems continuously respond to very small changes in pressure and movement. And even with current scientific knowledge, we already know that a very special gas molecule is involved in this process. Nitric oxide, or NO, is a substance that your body produces itself, especially in the nasal sinuses, where its concentration is significantly higher than in the normal air you inhale. What is interesting is that nitric oxide is not a minor or secondary detail. It has a very specific role in physiology because it is a powerful vasodilator, meaning it can expand blood vessels, allowing blood to flow more easily. At the same time, it also has the ability to dilate the bronchi, helping the airways expand and reducing resistance to airflow. When you return to the act of singing, you will see that the mechanical vibrations you create do not just exist at the vocal folds, but also travel up to the nasal sinuses, where nitric oxide is produced. And when air moves through these cavities with a stronger and more regular rhythm, it can carry more nitric oxide molecules into the airflow going down to the lungs. This leads to a very specific consequence. When nitric oxide enters the lungs, it participates in the gas exchange process at the alveoli, where oxygen is transferred into the blood and carbon dioxide is removed. By dilating the blood vessels around the alveoli, nitric oxide can help increase the efficiency of this process, meaning that with the same amount of air, your body can absorb more oxygen. At the same time, the dilation of the bronchi reduces resistance in the airways, making it easier for air to enter and exit the lungs. And this can explain a very familiar experience that many people have but do not analyze: the feeling of breathing more easily after singing or holding a long note. That feeling is not a psychological illusion, but a direct consequence of the physical and chemical parameters in the respiratory system having changed. If you look at the entire process as a continuous chain, you will see a very clear structure. You start with a mechanical oscillation at the vocal folds. That oscillation propagates through the tissues and cavities in the head, affecting the way air moves. This in turn affects the way molecules like nitric oxide are distributed and delivered into the lungs. And finally, it leads to changes in the way your body processes oxygen at the microscopic level. What is important here is that none of the steps in this chain is random or mysterious. Each step can be explained by physical and biological principles that we already know. And that means when you sing, you are not just creating sound to listen to or to communicate. You are activating a real chemical process, a process that can affect the way your body operates in real time. So by what path does that energy actually travel through your body? And here we have to leave ordinary intuition behind, because most people think sound is something that comes out of the mouth, enters the room, reaches someone else's ear, and then disappears. But physically, sound has never been limited to air. Sound is simply a mechanical oscillation propagating through a material medium, and that medium can be gas, liquid, or solid, as long as the particles in the medium can pass the oscillation to one another. So there is no reason to think that sound waves only exist outside your body and not inside it, especially when the human body is largely made up of water, soft tissue, bone, and air-filled cavities. That is an almost ideal mixture for transmitting and reflecting mechanical oscillations. In fact, if you compare it with simple numbers, you will see this clearly right away in air at room temperature. The speed of sound is only about 343 meters per second, but in the soft tissue of the human body, that number is about 1,540 meters per second, more than 4 times faster. And that is not a minor detail, because it means that when your vocal folds begin to oscillate, the mechanical energy does not just go outward through the mouth and nose, but is also pumped directly into the surrounding tissues at very high speed, spreading through the neck, through the laryngeal muscles, through the connective tissues, through the skeletal system and air cavities in the body along paths you cannot see but can completely feel if you pay attention in the right places. That is why when you hold a strong low note, you don't just hear it, you also feel it in your sternum, in your chest, and sometimes even in your arms if you place your hand in the right position. And when you sing a high note, you can feel a light vibration in the face area, the cheekbones, behind the nose, or even inside the skull. And I want to emphasize that this is not the poetic language of singers. It is a precise physical description of the phenomenon of wave transmission in the body. Your skull, for example, is not just a hard shell containing the brain. It is also a very good solid structure for conducting vibrations, something we have known from the phenomenon of bone conduction. And that is why, when you hear your own voice in a recording, it always sounds strangely unfamiliar, because the voice you hear from inside your head is a combination of 2 different paths: sound transmitted through air to the outer ear, and sound transmitted directly through bone and tissue to the inner ear. That means even in the most ordinary listening experience, your body has already been acting as a wave transmitting medium. The chest is the same. It is not just a bony frame protecting the heart and lungs. It is a mechanical oscillation system consisting of ribs, sternum, intercostal muscles, air-filled lungs, heart, blood vessels, and soft tissue. And when a low note is sustained long enough, this entire structure can begin to vibrate like a resonance box. not much different in principle from the body of a violin or the body of a guitar, except that here the instrument is alive, has blood flowing through it, has nerves running through it, and has chemicals being released while it vibrates. This is very important because if your body were only a simple sound-producing machine, then most biological effects would have to come from you hearing your own sound with your ears. But if your body is both the generator and the transmitting medium, then the impact does not have to wait until it reaches the ear to begin. It can start right at the vibrating vocal folds, then spread through the tissues, touch neighboring structures, reflect off bones, amplify in resonant cavities, and come back to affect the very systems lying in the path of the oscillation. In other words, the energy you create when singing does not leave you immediately. Part of it stays, moves within you, redistributes within you, and interacts with your structures in real time. An engineer would look at this as a problem of wave transmission in a complex medium. A physicist would say that you have a vibration source, multiple coupled media, reflective surfaces, resonant cavities, natural frequencies, and parallel energy transmission paths. And an ordinary person simply says, "I feel my body vibrating when I sing." And it turns out that ordinary description is much closer to the truth than we usually think, because your body really does vibrate, in the strictest physical sense of the word. And when you understand that, you begin to see that singing cannot be just a musical or social behavior, because it is mobilizing the entire body as an active medium, a space where energy is generated, transmitted, reflected, amplified, and perceived simultaneously. You are not just using the body to create sound. Your body becomes part of the sound wave itself. And once that is true, then everything that follows from changes in breathing to changes in the nervous system and chemistry is no longer mysterious, because you already have the first necessary condition for all those effects, a mechanical oscillation field spreading throughout the body every time you sing. And if you want to test everything I just said in the most direct way possible, I want you to try a very simple experiment right now. Place your hand on your neck, right at the position of the larynx, and produce a sustained sound any sound will do. The first thing you notice is not the sound, but the vibration, a very clear mechanical movement under your fingertips. And this is more important than you think, because it shows you that what is fundamentally happening here is not creating sound, but creating oscillation. And sound is only what happens when that oscillation spreads outward and is picked up by your ear or someone else's ear. But if you keep your hand there a little longer and pay closer attention, you will realize that this vibration does not stay in one place. It spreads downward to the neck area, down to the chest. And if you change the pitch, you can feel it shift with low notes, creating deeper vibrations in the chest, while high notes tend to concentrate more in the face and head area. And that shows that you do not just have a vibration source. You have an entire system for transmitting and distributing mechanical energy in the body. And that system operates continuously every time you produce sound. If you look at this from a physics perspective, the amplitude of these vibrations is large enough to create local pressure changes in the tissues. And although these changes are small in absolute terms, they occur at a very high frequency, hundreds of times per second. And it is precisely this repetition that makes their impact significant. Because in physics, a small force that repeats continuously can create a large effect over time. And that is exactly what is happening in your body when you sing. I want you to note a point that we often overlook. The sound you hear is actually only a very small part of the entire phenomenon, because most of the oscillation energy does not go out into space, but is absorbed and transmitted within your body. That means the real physical experience of singing lies more inside you than outside you. And this completely reverses the way we usually think about the voice, because instead of seeing it as a tool for communicating with the outside world, you must begin to see it as a process in which your body acts upon itself. If you continue the experiment a little further and try changing the intensity, singing softly and then singing loudly, you will notice that stronger vibrations not only sound louder, but also feel clearer, deeper, and more widespread. And that shows the direct relationship between the energy you put into the system and the level of oscillation that your body experiences. And this is not an abstract concept. It is a mechanical system that can be described by equations, in which energy from the airflow is converted into oscillation of the vocal folds, then transmitted into the tissues, reflected off bony structures, and amplified in resonant cavities, forming a complex network of oscillations. The most important thing I want you to take away here is that sound is not the cause, it is the result. The cause is mechanical vibration, and when you understand that, you will begin to see that the voice is actually a form of energy, more specifically, mechanical energy that is generated, transmitted, and distributed within the body. And that energy does not disappear. It interacts with everything it passes through, from soft tissue to blood vessels, from nerves to internal organs. And that means every time you speak or sing, you are not just sending a signal out into the world. You are creating an energy field inside yourself, a field that your body must respond to in one way or another. And once you look at the voice this way, as a flow of mechanical energy moving through a living system, then what we will say next about its influence on the nervous system, the immune system, and other biological processes will no longer seem strange at all, because you have already seen the first condition. There is a real energy source, there is a real transmitting medium, and there is a body that is truly experiencing the entire process every time you produce a sound. You need to understand how these vibrations not only exist, but are also amplified, because your body is not a uniform block of matter. It is a system made up of many cavities, many surfaces, and many structures capable of reflecting and enhancing oscillations. And in physics, when you have a system like that, you almost certainly have resonance. That is, the phenomenon in which an oscillation is amplified when it matches the natural frequency of the system containing it. Think about your oral cavity, your throat cavity, your nasal cavity, the sinuses inside your skull. All these empty spaces are not random details of anatomy. They are natural resonance chambers. And each chamber has its own shape, volume, and physical characteristics, meaning each chamber has a set of frequencies that it amplifies better than others. And when you sing, you are not creating just a single frequency, but a spectrum of frequencies, and your body selects which components of that spectrum to amplify through resonance. And that is exactly why the same musical note can sound very different depending on how you open your mouth, the position of your tongue, or how you adjust your throat cavity, because you're changing the resonance conditions of the system. But what is even more interesting is that resonance does not just change the sound you hear, it also changes the mechanical energy inside your body. Because when a resonance system is stimulated at the right frequency, the amplitude of the oscillation can increase many times compared to the original oscillation. And that means the vibrational energy you create at the vocal folds is not only transmitted but also amplified at certain locations in the body. If you have ever sung a note that made your entire chest area vibrate more strongly than usual, or a high note that made you feel a light pressure in the face and forehead area, that is exactly the sign of resonance happening, where part of your body is oscillating with greater amplitude because it matches the frequency of the stimulating source. This is completely the same as the way a musical instrument works, and this is not a figurative comparison. It is a similarity in physical principle, because a guitar, for example, does not produce a strong sound just because of the strings, but because of the body a hollow cavity designed to resonate with the vibration of the strings and amplify it. And if you remove the strings from the guitar body and pluck them in the air, you will almost hear nothing, because you have removed the resonance system. Your body works in a similar way. The vocal folds are only the initial vibration source, while the cavities in the body act like the guitar body, amplifying and shaping that vibration. And this leads to an important conclusion that I want you to keep. You do not sing with just your vocal folds. You sing with your entire body. Moreover, because these resonance cavities are made of living tissue, they do not just respond passively, like the wood of a musical instrument. They can change shape, tension, and physical characteristics in real time, meaning you can adjust your resonance system flexibly in a way that a regular musical instrument cannot. And that is why the human voice has a much more complex expressive ability than most mechanical devices. But what is more important for us here is not music, but the biological consequences of this amplification. Because when the amplitude of the oscillation increases in a certain region of the body, the mechanical energy acting on the tissues in that region also increases. And that can affect the way the cells, blood vessels, and nerves in that area respond. That means resonance is not just an acoustic phenomenon, it is a mechanism for distributing and enhancing energy in a living body. If you look at the entire process from the beginning until now, you will see a very clear chain. You create oscillation at the vocal folds. That oscillation spreads through the body, and at certain positions it is amplified through resonance, creating regions with higher vibration energy. And it is precisely these regions that can play an important role in activating the biological responses we will continue to explore. And so when you sing, you are not just creating sound to listen to, you are operating a living resonance system, a system in which every part of the body can participate in amplifying and distributing energy. And that makes this seemingly simple action a much more complex process than what we usually think. At this point, if you look back at everything we have just gone through, you will begin to see something very important. This is not a collection of separate phenomena, but a continuous chain of causes, starting from a very simple mechanical oscillation and leading to measurable biological changes. And what I want to do now is connect all those pieces together step by step without skipping any link, because if you skip one step, the entire system will seem magical. But if you keep all the steps, it becomes a completely logical process. You start with a flow of air going up from the lungs, creating pressure. That pressure interacts with the vocal folds and creates mechanical oscillation. This oscillation happens hundreds of times per second and forms a series of energy pulses. These pulses do not just go outward, but also go inward into the body, spreading through the soft tissues, through the bones, through the hollow cavities. And when they encounter structures with matching frequencies, they are amplified through resonance, creating regions with higher oscillation amplitude. And it is precisely these oscillations that begin to interact with your biological environment. At the same time, part of the oscillation travels up to the nasal sinuses, where nitric oxide is produced, and the mechanical vibration increases gas exchange in these cavities, helping to release nitric oxide into the airflow more quickly. Nitric oxide then enters the lungs, where it dilates blood vessels and bronchi, improving airflow and blood circulation, and that leads to more efficient oxygen exchange, meaning from a mechanical oscillation, you have arrived at a change in your body's metabolic process. But this chain does not stop there, because the oscillations also spread through the neck area, where there are important neural structures such as the vagus nerve. And although we will talk about this in more detail later, you can already see that any repeated mechanical vibration in this area has the potential to stimulate sensory receptors and affect neural signals. And that opens a second pathway, where mechanical energy is converted into biological signals through the nervous system. If you look at this entire process as a diagram, you will see that it has no leaps, no step that appears out of nowhere. Each step has a specific physical or biological mechanism. Pressure creates oscillation. Oscillation creates waves. Waves propagate. Propagation leads to resonance. Resonance increases amplitude. Higher amplitude increases interaction with tissues. Interaction with tissues leads to changes in airflow, in chemicals, in neural signals, and finally to changes in the overall physiological state. What is important here is that there is no random element in this chain, no miracle, no step based on belief or subjective feeling. Everything is processes that can be described by physics and biology. And if you have the right tools, you can measure each step in that chain one by one. This is exactly the point where I think many people often misunderstand. They think the benefits of singing are psychological or emotional. But in reality, most of what is happening is the direct result of a very specific physical, biological chain of causes. And emotion is only one of the final expressions of that chain. So when you sing, you are not activating a vague system. You are activating a tightly linked chain of responses, where each step depends on the one before it. And if you remove the first step, that is, the mechanical oscillation, then the entire chain afterward will not happen, or at least will not happen as strongly. And this leads to a conclusion that I want you to keep before we continue. Singing is not a single behavior with a single effect. It is the starting point of a system in which physics turns into chemistry, chemistry turns into physiology, and all of that is linked together by clear, consistent, and predictable mechanisms. And once you look at it this way, you will begin to see that the question is no longer does singing have an effect or not, but how can a simple chain of mechanisms spread out and affect the entire body like this? If you continue to follow this chain in the direction of respiration, you will see a key point that we just touched on, but have not gone deep into yet. Nitric oxide is not just an interesting chemical detail, but actually plays a direct role in changing the way your body processes oxygen. And to understand this, you need to look at how gas exchange takes place in the lungs. Because the lungs are not simply an airbag, they are an extremely complex structure with hundreds of millions of alveoli, where oxygen from the air enters the blood and carbon dioxide is removed. And the efficiency of this process depends on two main factors: the amount of air that can reach the alveoli and the level of blood circulation around them. Nitric oxide acts on both of these factors at the same time, because it has the ability to dilate the bronchi, meaning the air tubes in the lungs expand, reducing airflow resistance and allowing air to go deeper into the lung regions. At the same time, it also dilates the small blood vessels around the alveoli, which improves blood distribution and increases oxygen absorption capacity. And when these two processes happen simultaneously, you have a more efficient gas exchange system, meaning with the same breathing rate, you can bring more oxygen into the blood. This is not an abstract hypothesis, but a physiological effect that has been measured in many studies on nitric oxide and respiration. And it also explains something you may have experienced but did not know how to express: the feeling of breathing more easily when you sing or hold a melody for a few minutes. That feeling is not because you are relaxing in the psychological sense, but because your airways have actually expanded. Airflow has become smoother, and the oxygen exchange process has become more efficient at the microscopic level. If you want to look at this in a quantitative way, imagine that under normal conditions, a significant portion of the air you inhale is not used to its maximum because of uneven distribution in the lungs. But when nitric oxide is increased, that distribution becomes more uniform, meaning more lung regions participate in gas exchange. And this can lead to a significant improvement in blood oxygenation, especially in conditions where breathing is restricted. In addition, the reduction in airway resistance also means that the respiratory muscles, including the diaphragm and intercostal muscles, have to work less to achieve the same amount of ventilation. And this can contribute to creating a feeling of lightness and less effort when breathing, a feeling that many people describe after singing without realizing the physical cause behind it. All of this leads to a very important point. What you feel is not a subjective illusion, but the result of specific physiological changes that can be measured by indicators such as airflow rate, bronchial dilation, and nitric oxide levels in the airways. A doctor can measure these changes with medical equipment, and they will see that after a short period of performing vibrating activities like humming or singing, there are clear changes in respiratory function. This puts the entire phenomenon into a completely different context, because it shows that the act of singing is not only related to sound or emotion, but is also a way to directly affect one of the most important systems in the body, the respiratory system, and through that influence the basic energy supply for the entire body, that is, oxygen. When you understand this, you begin to see that every time you sing, you are changing the operating conditions of the body at a very basic level, not by willpower or belief, but by changing the physical and chemical parameters of the respiratory system. And that is why this effect can occur consistently and repeatedly, no matter who you are or what you believe, because it does not depend on your perception. It depends on the way your body is structured and the way physical and biological laws apply to it. And once you accept that these changes do not stop at the lungs but spread throughout the entire body, then the next step is to ask, where do these signals go and how do they affect other systems, especially the nervous system, which controls almost every vital function that you are not conscious of? And it is right here, when you trace the path that these biological signals travel, that you will encounter a structure that I think is central to this entire story, the vagus nerve. A nerve that, if you laid it out, would be one of the longest in the body, It starts from the brain, goes down the neck, runs through the chest, and connects directly to the heart, lungs, and even the digestive system. And this makes it a kind of biological highway carrying information between the brain and the internal organs, especially in the autonomic nervous system, where functions like heart rate, breathing, and digestion are regulated without you having to think about them. What is interesting is that the location of this nerve is not somewhere deep and isolated, but it runs right through the area we have just been talking about. That is, the larynx and throat, where you are creating vibration when you sing. And that means every time your vocal folds oscillate, you are not only creating sound waves and activating chemical responses, but you are also creating direct mechanical stimuli on the tissues where the vagus nerve passes. This is a very important point, because in physiology there are many ways to activate the nervous system, but most of them are indirect, through chemical signals or through perception. But here you have a form of repeated mechanical stimulation at a frequency of hundreds of times per second, right at the position where this nerve can sense it. This means you do not need to think about relaxing or try to control your body. You are sending signals directly into the nervous system through physical vibration. If you think about how mechanoreceptors in the body work, they respond to pressure, vibration, and stretching of tissues. And when the vocal folds oscillate, they create local pressure changes and micro movements in the surrounding tissues. And these changes can be detected by receptors related to the vagus nerve, thereby sending signals back up to the brain. This creates a loop that you can imagine as follows: mechanical oscillation at the larynx, stimulation of receptors, neural signal traveling through the vagus nerve, brain processing, regulatory signals returning to organs such as the heart and lungs. And the entire process happens without the intervention of consciousness. This is exactly why many effects of singing, such as changes in heart rate or feelings of relaxation, can occur even when you are not trying to make them happen, because the system is being activated at a much more basic level than thought. Another noteworthy point is that the frequency of the oscillations from the voice falls within the range that the nervous system can respond to very sensitively, because it is not a single stimulus but a rapid sequence of repeated stimuli. And in neurobiology, such repeated signals can have a much stronger impact than a single stimulus of the same amplitude, because they create a form of entrainment or synchronization of neural signals. When you look at this entire process, you begin to see that singing is not just an act of creating sound or improving breathing, but also a way to interact directly with your nervous system through a physical mechanism. And this explains why techniques like chanting or humming have been used in many cultures long before we understood the vagus nerve. Because although they did not know the name of this structure, they were unintentionally using the exact mechanism to affect it. The most important thing I want you to keep here is the difference between indirect stimulation and direct stimulation. Because when you listen to music, most of the impact goes through the auditory system and is processed by the brain in a way that depends on perception. But when you sing, you are creating a direct mechanical stimulus on a nerve that controls the basic functions of the body. And this happens regardless of what you think about it. So if you ask why a simple action like singing can lead to deep changes in the body, the answer begins to become clearer, because you are not just feeling something. You are activating one of the central control systems of the body through a specific, repeated, and predictable physical pathway. Once the signal passes through the vagus nerve, it does not stop at simply transmitting information. It actually changes the operating state of the entire autonomic nervous system, specifically shifting your body toward the parasympathetic system. That is, the branch responsible for rest, recovery, and maintaining homeostasis, in contrast to the sympathetic system, which is involved in stress responses and the fight or flight reaction. To understand this clearly, you can imagine the body as a system with two main modes. One mode that prioritizes quick action, energy consumption, and response to danger, and another mode that prioritizes energy conservation, repair, and recovery. What determines which mode you are in is not your willpower, but the neural signals your body receives. When vibrations from the voice repeatedly stimulate the vagus nerve, they send signals to the brain that the environment is safe, that there is no immediate threat, And from there, they triggered a series of physiological responses related to the parasympathetic system, including lowering heart rate, stabilizing blood pressure, and readjusting the activity of the internal organs. One of the clearest signs of this shift is the change in stress hormone levels, especially cortisol, a hormone released when the body is in a state of prolonged stress. Many studies have shown that activities like singing, especially prolonged singing or group singing, can significantly reduce cortisol levels in the blood in a relatively short period of time. This is not a vague psychological effect, but a measurable biochemical change. And it reflects that the body's central control system has shifted from a state of alertness to a state of recovery. When cortisol decreases, a series of other processes begin to change accordingly. The immune system functions more efficiently, digestion improves, and the body is in a better position to repair cellular damage. And all of this happens not because you are trying to relax, but because the input signals to the nervous system have changed. A very important point here is the difference between sensation and mechanism, because you may feel relaxed after singing and think that it is only because you like music, but in reality that feeling is the consequence of a specific chain of physiological changes, starting from mechanical vibration, passing through the vagus nerve, and ending with the regulation of autonomic nervous system activity. This explains why even people without musical training, or even those who do not sing well, can still experience similar effects, because the body does not care about the quality of the music. It responds to the physical properties of the oscillations, and the way those oscillations stimulate the nervous system. When you look at this entire process, you begin to see that singing is not just an act of entertainment or expression, but a biological mechanism that can directly and systematically adjust the state of the body. And this completely changes the way we should understand the relationship between sound and physiology, because sound is not just something you hear. It is a form of stimulation that can restructure the way your body functions at the most basic level through a clear, repeated, and predictable pathway. What makes this entire mechanism special is not that it exists, but the speed at which it occurs, because the physiological changes we have just discussed do not need hours or days to appear. They can begin after just a few minutes of singing, or even just holding a sustained note. And this is very important, because it shows that this is not a long-term cumulative effect, but an almost immediate biological response of the body to a specific form of stimulation. When you create continuous mechanical vibration at the larynx, that signal is transmitted to the tissues, stimulates the vagus nerve, affects the autonomic nervous system, and leads to adjustments in heart rate, blood pressure, and hormone levels. And this entire chain does not require any mental activation on your part. It occurs in the same way your pupils constrict when exposed to bright light, completely automatic and without thought. This means you do not need to believe that singing has an effect. You do not need to expect a result. And you do not even need to like singing, because your body does not operate based on belief. It operates based on the physical and chemical signals it receives. One way to understand this is to compare it with other reflexes in the body. For example, when you inhale a cold stream of air, your airways react immediately without you having to decide it. And singing works in a similar way, except that the stimulation here is high frequency and repeated vibration. Studies in physiology have shown that after only 5 to 10 minutes of singing or humming, clear changes can be observed in indicators such as heart rate variability, HRV, and cortisol levels. And this aligns with what we would expect from a system controlled by the vagus nerve, because this is a fast response pathway designed to adjust the body's state in real time. Another interesting point is that this effect does not depend heavily on technique or sound quality. You do not need to sing the right notes or have a good voice, because the important factor is not the music, but the existence of the mechanical oscillation and the way it is sustained for a long enough time to activate the system. This explains why simple actions like humming, chanting, or even producing an sound can create similar effects, because they all produce continuous vibration in the laryngeal area and resonance cavities. When you look at this from a systems perspective, you will see that your body is like an electrical circuit that can be turned on almost immediately when the right input signal is present. And singing is precisely one of those signals, a signal that does not need to be learned in a complex way and that almost anyone can produce. The most important thing I want you to realize here is the separation between subjective experience and objective mechanism, because you may not feel anything special in the first few minutes, or you may feel a clear change. But regardless of what you feel, the physiological processes are still happening because they do not depend on your perception. And when you understand that, you begin to see that singing is not an action you hope will have an effect, but a way to directly intervene in the body's biological system, with effects that can begin to appear in a very short time, as long as the right physical conditions are established. One of the clearest pieces of evidence that what we are talking about is not just theory, but a phenomenon that can be observed and measured lies in the way the heart responds when you sing. And here there is a very interesting study by Bjorn Vikhoff in which scientists monitored the heart rates of a group of people while they sang together under different conditions. The results showed something quite surprising. The heart rates of the participants began to synchronize with one another over time, meaning not only did each individual change their own physiological state, but many different bodies began to oscillate at the same rhythm. To understand this, you need to go back to a factor we have mentioned but not analyzed in depth: breathing rhythm. Because when you sing, you no longer breathe in the normal way. You extend your breath. You control your breathing rhythm according to the structure of the lyrics or melody. And this creates a form of rhythmic, slower, and more regular breathing compared to natural breathing. And it is precisely this breathing rhythm that has a direct influence on heart rate through a mechanism called respiratory sinus arrhythmia, in which heart rate increases slightly when you inhale and decreases when you exhale. When many people sing the same song with the same rhythmic structure, they unintentionally synchronize their breathing rhythms. And because heart rate is influenced by breathing rhythm, this leads to their heart rates also beginning to synchronize according to the same oscillation pattern. What is interesting here is not just that the numbers become similar, but the way the biological systems of many different individuals can phase lock with one another through a common signal, in this case, sound and breathing rhythm. And this brings us back to a very basic concept in physics: oscillating systems. When you have many independent oscillating systems, each with its own frequency, but you place them in an environment where they can interact, they tend to synchronize over time, a phenomenon that has been observed in many different systems, from pendulums to electrical circuits to biological systems. The human body, with its heart, lungs, and nervous system, is in fact a collection of linked oscillating systems, and singing creates a common control signal, strong enough to make these systems synchronize not only within one body, but also between many different bodies. This means that when you sing, you are not only adjusting your own internal state, but also participating in a synchronization process at the group level, where many bodies begin to function as a unified oscillating system. And once you look at this from that perspective, you will see that what seems like an emotional experience when singing with others actually has a very clear physical foundation, because this synchronization does not require language or consciousness. It occurs through mechanical and physiological signals that all bodies can respond to. The most important thing here is the shift in the way we understand the body, because instead of viewing the heart, lungs, and other organs as separate parts working independently, you begin to see them as components of a larger oscillating system where rhythm, frequency, and interaction play a central role. And singing, with its clear rhythmic structure and ability to create continuous oscillation, becomes one of the most direct ways to intervene in that system. When you put all of this together, the conclusion is almost unavoidable. Your body does not just react to sound, it operates as an oscillating system, and singing is a way to bring that system into a more ordered, more synchronized, and more predictable state, not only at the individual level, but also at the group level. This phenomenon becomes even clearer when you do not look at a single individual, but at a group of people singing together. Because at that level, what we have just described is no longer a small change in one body, but becomes an observable collective process, where many biological systems begin to interact and adjust to one another in real time. And the first thing you notice is that when many people sing the same melody, they do not just produce the same sound, but also begin to share the same breathing rhythm. because the structure of the song forces them to inhale and exhale at the same moments. And once the breathing rhythm is synchronized, the other systems affected by breathing rhythm, especially heart rate, also begin to change according to the same pattern. This leads to a phenomenon that you can describe in a very simple way. Many different bodies begin to oscillate at the same rhythm, and although each body is still a separate system, they are no longer operating completely independently, but become part of a larger oscillating system, in which information does not need to be transmitted through language, but is transmitted through rhythm and vibration. If you look at this from a physics perspective, it fully aligns with what we know about synchronized oscillating systems. Because when many oscillators can interact with one another through a common signal, they tend to phase lock, that is, adjust their frequency and phase to match one another. And this phenomenon has been observed in many natural systems, from pendulums hanging on the same beam, to heart cells beating together, to fireflies flashing in synchrony at night. When you place humans in that context, many people singing together creates an environment where sound oscillations and breathing rhythms serve as linking signals, allowing individual biological systems to begin synchronizing. And this does not require conscious coordination. It occurs naturally when the right physical conditions are established. A noteworthy point is that this synchronization is not limited to heart rate or breathing rhythm, but can also spread to other aspects of the nervous system. Because when many people experience the same oscillation pattern, their neural signals also tend to become more synchronized. And this can create a feeling of connection that many people describe when participating in group singing. But once again, that does not necessarily need to be explained by emotion first. It can be understood as a consequence of the physical synchronization between biological systems. When you look at a choir, you do not just see a group of people creating beautiful sound. You are looking at a system in which dozens or hundreds of bodies are operating as linked oscillators, sharing the same rhythm, the same time structure, and the same flow of mechanical energy. And this reduces chaos in each individual system, bringing the entire group into a more ordered state. This also explains why even people who do not know one another can quickly connect when singing together, because the synchronization process does not require understanding or complex communication. It only requires a common signal that is strong and stable enough. And sound combined with breathing rhythm is exactly that signal. When you synthesize all of this, you begin to see that group singing is not just a social or artistic activity, but a clear example of complex systems physics in biology, where many independent units can self-organize into a synchronized system through simple but repeated interactions. And this further reinforces an idea we have been building from the beginning. The human body does not just react to sound, it operates as an oscillating system. And when many bodies participate in that process together, you do not just have many individual oscillating systems. You have a linked network of oscillations operating as a unified entity in terms of rhythm and energy. What makes this synchronization phenomenon even more interesting is that it does not stop at the level of physical or physiological oscillation, but also extends to neurochemistry, where mechanical signals and rhythms begin to influence the way the brain regulates the feeling of connection between people. And here we must talk about a familiar molecule in social biology, oxytocin, a hormone often called the bonding hormone because of its role in creating feelings of trust, attachment, and cooperation between individuals. Oxytocin is released in many different contexts, such as during close physical contact, when caring for children, or when participating in cooperative activities. But what is noteworthy is that recent studies have also shown that oxytocin levels can increase when people engage in synchronized activities like group singing. This is not a random coincidence, because when you look back at what we have just analyzed, you will see that group singing creates an environment in which many biological systems are synchronized through breathing rhythm, heart rate, and mechanical oscillation. And this synchronization can be interpreted by the brain as a signal that you are in a safe and cooperative environment, thereby activating chemical mechanisms related to social bonding. When oxytocin levels rise, it affects many areas in the brain related to emotion and social behavior, reducing feelings of anxiety, increasing trust, and promoting cooperative tendencies. And this can explain why many people feel a strong sense of connection with others when singing together, even if they did not know one another beforehand. What is important here is that this feeling does not necessarily have to start from consciousness or thought. It can be the direct result of biochemical changes in the brain, triggered by the physical and physiological signals the body receives during the singing process. When you place this in a broader context, you begin to see a very clear link between physics, biology, and social behavior. Mechanical oscillation leads to synchronization of breathing rhythm and heart rate. This synchronization activates neural signals through structures like the vagus nerve, and those signals ultimately lead to changes in the release of hormones such as oxytocin, thereby affecting the way you perceive and interact with those around you. This is a classic example of how different systems in the body do not operate independently, but are linked together into a network, in which a change at the physical level can spread and manifest at the psychological and social level. Another interesting point is that this process does not require you to understand it for it to happen. Just like the mechanisms we have discussed before, it is part of the way the body is designed. And that means when you participate in an activity like group singing, you are not just creating sound or taking part in a cultural activity. You are activating a series of biological mechanisms deeply integrated into your system mechanisms that have existed and been refined through evolution to support bonding and cooperation between humans. When you look at the entire picture, you begin to see that the feeling of connection that many people describe when singing together is not a vague or purely subjective phenomenon, but can be traced back to specific physical, physiological, and chemical processes. And this makes the entire experience consistent with what we have built from the beginning, from a simple mechanical oscillation to complex changes in the body and behavior. All of it is part of the same tightly linked system. When you look at the immune system, because here you begin to see that what started as a mechanical oscillation and spread through the nervous system eventually reaches one of the most important systems for life. And specifically, we need to talk about a component called immunoglobulin A, or Ig, a type of antibody that serves as the body's first line of defense, especially at surfaces that come into contact with the external environment, such as the respiratory tract and the digestive system. Ig is present in saliva, in mucous membranes, and in other secretions, and its job is to recognize and neutralize pathogens before they penetrate deeper into the body. So higher levels of Ig are usually associated with better protection against infection. What is interesting is that many studies have shown that singing activity, especially singing continuously for a period of time, can increase Ig levels in saliva after just a short time. And this suggests that the immune system does not only respond to factors like nutrition or sleep, but also to the physiological signals we have just discussed. When you connect this with what was said earlier about cortisol, you begin to see a very clear relationship, because cortisol, when at high levels for a long time, can suppress the activity of the immune system, reduce the ability to produce antibodies, and make the body more vulnerable to pathogens. And when activities like singing help reduce cortisol levels through activation of the parasympathetic system, they indirectly create conditions for the immune system to function more effectively. This is not speculation, but a logical chain that can be traced. Mechanical vibration stimulates the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve regulates the autonomic nervous system. The parasympathetic system is activated and reduces cortisol, and lower cortisol levels allow the immune system, including the production of Ig, to operate at a higher level. When you look at this entire process, you see that singing does not directly create antibodies in a simple sense, but it changes the physiological environment in a way that allows the body to regulate itself better, and that is a subtle but effective way to influence the immune system. Another noteworthy point is that this effect does not require a long time to begin, similar to the changes in the nervous system and respiration. Ig levels can increase after a singing session lasting a few dozen minutes. This shows that the immune system has the ability to respond quite quickly to the right physiological signals. When you put all of this into the same picture, you begin to see that the body does not operate as separate systems, but as a connected network, where a change at one point can spread to many other points, and singing, through the chain of mechanisms we have analyzed, becomes a way to activate multiple systems simultaneously, from respiratory, nervous, to immune. This also helps explain why in many cultures, activities like singing chanting, or group singing are often linked to health and recovery, even when people do not understand the scientific mechanism behind them, because they have observed the real effects of these actions. When you look at this from the perspective of modern science, you do not need to rely on tradition or belief to explain it. You can see each step in the chain of causes clearly, and that makes the conclusion stronger. Singing is not just an expressive or entertainment activity. It is a way for the body to regulate itself, to strengthen its defensive capabilities through mechanisms that are already built in. And all of it starts from something very simple: the mechanical vibration you create when you produce a sound. Another aspect you might not expect when looking at this entire chain is the way it affects pain perception. Because when you move from systems like respiration and immunity to the sensory nervous system, you begin to see that singing does not only change the way the body operates, but also changes the way you experience your own body. And here we need to talk about endorphins, a group of endogenous peptides that act as the body's natural painkillers. Endorphins are released in many different contexts, such as during intense exercise, when laughing, or when participating in rhythmic and repetitive activities. And what is important is that they have the ability to bind to opioid receptors in the brain and nervous system, reducing pain signals and creating a feeling of well-being. When you sing, especially for a long enough period or in a group setting, you not only activate the autonomic nervous system, but can also stimulate the release of endorphins through the combination of vibration, rhythm, and controlled breathing. And the result is that your pain threshold can increase, meaning the same painful stimulus will be perceived as less intense or later than usual. Studies have shown that people who participate in group singing or synchronized sound activities can tolerate higher levels of pain compared to when they are at rest. And this does not require any attention-distracting factors. It is a real physiological change in the way the nervous system processes signals. When you compare this with passively listening to music, the difference becomes clear, because listening to music can create emotional responses and sometimes also stimulate a certain level of endorphin release, but it lacks the direct mechanical element that singing provides, lacks the involvement of the respiratory system, and lacks the continuous stimulation of structures like the vagus nerve. In other words, when you listen to music, you mainly activate brain regions related to cognition and emotion, while when you sing, you activate an entire chain from the physical to the biological. And it is precisely this difference that makes the effect on pain threshold stronger. One way to visualize this is to see singing as a process in which your body not only receives signals, but also generates signals. And it is the act of generating those signals with their repetition and intensity that is the strong factor activating the endogenous pain relief systems. When you sustain a long note, you create a continuous stream of stimulation to the nervous system, and the system responds by readjusting the way it processes other signals, including pain signals. And this can lead to a state in which feelings of discomfort decrease without any external intervention. If you look at this entire process in a broader context, you will see that it fully aligns with what we have built from the beginning. A mechanical oscillation leads to neural stimulation. Neural stimulation leads to chemical changes. And chemical changes lead to changes in the way the body operates and perceives. And pain reduction is just one of the manifestations of that chain. What is important is that this effect does not depend on whether you are a singer or not. It depends on whether you create vibration or not. And once that physical condition is met, the biological mechanisms behind it will automatically be activated, changing the way your body responds to stimuli from the environment and from within itself. When you step back and look at everything we have just gone through, what begins to emerge is no longer a list of separate effects, but a tightly connected network between many different biological systems, all activated from the same very simple starting point, the mechanical vibration you create when you sing. And to see this clearly, you only need to go through the chain we have built one by one, starting from the respiratory system, where the airflow from the lungs creates pressure. That pressure makes the vocal folds oscillate. And this oscillation not only creates sound, but also propagates into the tissues, stimulates structures in the neck and chest, and at the same time increases the release of nitric oxide from the nasal sinuses, thereby improving the oxygen exchange process in the lungs. From there, you move to the nervous system, where mechanical vibration stimulates the vagus nerve, leading to regulation of the autonomic nervous system, increasing the activity of the parasympathetic branch, and reducing the activity of the sympathetic branch. And this brings about changes in heart rate, blood pressure, and the overall state of the body, shifting it from stress mode to recovery mode. At the same time, the endocrine system also participates in this process with reduced cortisol levels and increased substances such as endorphins and oxytocin, each playing its own role from pain relief and increased well-being to enhance social bonding when the activity takes place in a group environment. The immune system is also not left out, with the increase in factors such as IgA, showing that the body is shifting to a state of more effective defensive state that is often diminished during prolonged stress, but is restored when the nervous system shifts to rest and repair mode. What is noteworthy is that all these systems do not operate independently. They continuously interact with one another because the nervous system controls the endocrine system. The endocrine system influences the immune system, and the respiratory system provides the basic energy for all these processes through oxygen. That means a change at one point can spread throughout the entire system through the pre-existing connections. When you sing, you are not choosing to activate each system individually. You are providing an input signal to which the entire system responds in a synchronized way. Just like when you apply force to one point in a tense net, the force does not stay only at the contact point, but spreads throughout the entire structure. One way to understand this is to think of the body as an integrated control system, where sensors receive physical signals. The central processor, the brain and nervous system, interprets that signal, and the executive organs respond accordingly. And in this case, the input signal is not light or external chemicals, but oscillations created by yourself. And this makes the process special, because you are both the source and the recipient of the signal. When you put all of this together, you begin to see that singing cannot be fully understood if looked at from only one angle, such as music or psychology, because it is simultaneously a physical phenomenon, a biological process, a neural mechanism, and a social behavior all existing and interacting in the same action. And precisely because of that, trying to separate these effects to analyze them individually may be useful scientifically, but it does not reflect the way the body actually works, because in reality, all these systems are activated at the same time and influence one another in real time. This leads to a conclusion that I think is central to the entire story. Singing is not a simple action with a single purpose. It is a multi-system action, a single input that can activate many different layers of responses in the body, from physical to chemical, from neural to immune, and from individual to collective. And once you look at it that way, you will see that what is surprising is not that singing has so many effects, but that we have become accustomed to dismissing it as a normal activity without realizing that it is activating one of the most complex and interconnected systems in the human body. If you expand your view beyond the individual body and look at the history of humankind, you will realize that the behavior we have just analyzed is not a recent invention or a random cultural feature, but a phenomenon that appears almost everywhere humans exist, because there is no known culture that completely lacks some form of singing or rhythmic sound making. From hunter-gatherer tribes to ancient civilizations to modern societies, wherever there are humans, there is singing. And this in itself is an important fact, because in evolution, traits that appear widely and persist over time are usually not random. They exist because they provide some advantage, even if that advantage is not always obvious on the surface. When you look at the ways singing is used in different contexts, you begin to see a repeating pattern. Singing is used to lull children to sleep, to coordinate collective labor, to convey information, to perform rituals, to reinforce group identity, and in many cases to maintain synchronization among individuals in a community. And if you place all these functions side by side, you will see that they all relate to two core elements of survival: communication and cooperation. Before language developed fully as it is today, the use of rhythmic sound may have been an effective way to convey emotional signals and intentions, because rhythm and pitch can carry information without vocabulary. And this remains true even today, when you can recognize emotion in someone's voice without understanding the language they are speaking. At the same time, the ability to synchronize behavior through singing or other forms of sound may have helped groups of people coordinate better in activities such as hunting, moving, or defense, where acting in rhythm could create a clear advantage. When you combine this with what we have analyzed biologically, the picture becomes clearer, because singing not only helps humans communicate and coordinate at the behavioral level, but also creates synchronization at the physiological level, from breathing rhythm and heart rate to neural and hormonal signals. And this can increase group cohesion, reduce conflict, and improve the ability to cooperate. A group of people does not just think, they are connected. Their bodies are actually functioning in a more synchronized way, and this can provide an advantage in environments where cooperation is the deciding factor. Another important point is that the biological benefits we have discussed, such as improved respiration, regulation of the nervous system, strengthened immunity, and pain reduction, are not random side effects. They may have played a role in maintaining the health and functioning of individuals, especially in harsh living conditions, where optimizing the body's basic functions could make the difference between life and death. When you look at all of this in an evolutionary context, you begin to see that singing is not just a cultural expression, but a trait that may have been maintained and reinforced across many generations because of the benefits it brings, both at the individual level and the group level. This does not mean humans evolved to sing in a simple sense, but that the biological mechanisms that allow singing in response to sound have been integrated into the body in a way that they can be used for many different purposes, and singing is one of the ways those mechanisms are utilized. When you look back at the entire chain we have built from mechanical oscillation to biological responses, and finally to social behavior, you will see that all these layers fit into a consistent evolutionary story in which a simple behavior can connect the physical, biological, and social into a single system. And it is precisely this integration that may be the reason why singing exists wherever humans exist. And if that is true, then the fact that we gradually sing less in the modern era is not just a cultural change, but maybe a disruption in the way our bodies and societies once operated throughout most of human history. From that perspective, you begin to see that singing cannot be fully explained if it is only viewed as a byproduct of culture or a simple form of entertainment, because what we have just analyzed shows that this behavior is tightly linked to a whole series of core biological mechanisms. And that raises another possibility. Singing exists not by chance, but because it provides specific benefits to the body and to human survival. In evolution, behaviors that consume energy without providing benefits are usually eliminated over time, especially if they are repeated frequently in daily life. And singing is clearly a behavior that consumes energy. It requires breath control, muscle activity, involvement of the nervous system, and many other processes. So the fact that it has existed widely and persistently for tens of thousands of years shows that it must provide some value that outweighs the cost it demands. When you combine this with what we have seen in the previous sections, from improving oxygen exchange, stimulating the autonomic nervous system, strengthening immunity, reducing pain, to creating synchronization between individuals, you begin to see that singing does not have just a single benefit, but a set of benefits spread across many different systems. And this makes it a particularly effective behavior in comprehensively affecting the body. An important point here is that these benefits do not depend on whether you want them to happen. They do not require intention or awareness. They occur as a direct consequence of the physical and biological properties of the action. And this is a typical sign of a biological function rather than an optional activity. When you look at other behaviors of the body, such as breathing, sleeping, or eating, you see that they also have similar characteristics. They are deeply integrated into the system, controlled by automatic mechanisms, and provide direct benefits for life. And although singing is not a mandatory need in the sense that you will die immediately if you do not do it, it seems to belong to another layer, where behaviors are not obligatory but still contribute to optimizing the state of the body and the ability to interact with the environment. This leads to a different understanding of singing, not as an activity that humans invented for entertainment, but as a way the body uses its existing capabilities to achieve multiple goals at once, from regulating homeostasis to strengthening social bonding. When you think about singing in this context, it begins to resemble other rhythmic and repetitive behaviors, such as walking, deep breathing, or exercising behaviors, to which the body responds positively, because they align with the way the system is designed. Another noteworthy point is the difference between producing sound and only listening to sound, because as we have seen, most of the biological mechanisms are activated by generating oscillation rather than just receiving it. And this emphasizes that the active behavior plays a central role in activating the system. When you only listen, you receive the signal at the auditory level. But when you sing, you generate the signal at the mechanical level. And it is precisely this difference that leads to the difference in the way the body responds. When you synthesize all of this, the conclusion becomes clearer. Singing is not a secondary behavior, not something added after the important functions have been perfected, but is part of the way the body operates as an integrated system in action that can activate many mechanisms at once and provide benefits on multiple levels. And once you look at it that way, you will begin to see that our tendency to view singing only as a form of entertainment may be an oversimplification, overlooking an important part of the way the human body interacts with itself and with those around it. When you return to the present moment with everything we have understood, you begin to see a very remarkable change, not at the theoretical level, but in the way people actually live their daily lives. Because for the vast majority of history, producing sound was a common and almost natural behavior. But in modern society, that role has gradually been replaced by the consumption of sound. And this shift did not happen because our bodies changed, but because the environment around us changed. The appearance of radio in the early 20th century, followed by television and recording devices, created an entirely new situation where you could listen to high-quality music without having to create it yourself. And this gradually transformed music from a directly participatory activity into a product for consumption, something you receive rather than create. When that happened, a behavior that was once repeated every day began to disappear from the everyday lives of most people. And what is important is that the body has no way to know that the environment has changed in that way. Because from a biological perspective, you are still the same system that evolved over tens of thousands of years, with the same mechanisms that respond to vibration, rhythm, and mechanical oscillation. This creates a gap between the way the body is designed to function and the way it is actually used. And that gap is not always obvious, because many of its consequences occur quietly and accumulate over time. When you replace singing with listening, you are not just changing one behavior. You are removing a direct mechanical stimulus to the body, a source that we have seen can affect respiration, the nervous system, the immune system, and many other systems. And instead, you only keep the auditory part of the experience. That is, the signal going into the ear and being processed by the brain, without the mechanical feedback from creating the sound yourself. This is similar to replacing a physical activity with watching someone else move. You still receive the information, but you do not receive the corresponding physiological impact. And in the long term, this difference can accumulate into significant changes in the way the body functions. Another important point is that the systems we have discussed, such as the autonomic nervous system or the immune system, do not need large stimuli to maintain an optimal state, but they do need regular, repeated stimuli. And singing in traditional life provided exactly that type of stimulus, while the modern environment lacks this part. When the stimulus decreases, the systems do not shut off immediately, but they may function less efficiently, just like a muscle that is not used will gradually weaken. And this can manifest in many different forms, from poorer stress regulation and less efficient breathing, to a decline in immune response capability. What is noteworthy is that these changes are not easily attributed to a single cause, because they are the result of many combined factors. And precisely because of that, the absence of a behavior like singing is often not recognized as a potential cause, even though it may contribute to the overall picture. When you look at this from a systems perspective, you begin to see that the modern environment has unintentionally removed part of the input that the body once used to regulate itself. And that means we're operating a complex system with some important signals missing, without necessarily realizing it. This does not mean that technology or modern music is bad. It only means that they have changed the way we interact with sound in a way that the body may not have fully adapted to. And when you combine this with everything we have analyzed from mechanical oscillation to biological responses, you begin to see that the shift from singing to listening is not just a cultural change, but maybe a physiologically meaningful change, affecting the way the body functions in subtle but accumulating ways over time. And once you look at it that way, the question is no longer whether singing is important or not, but what happens when a behavior that was once a regular part of human life gradually disappears, while the biological systems related to it remain intact and continue to wait for the signals they have been accustomed to receiving throughout the evolutionary history of humankind. And when you return to the starting point of this entire story, the original question we posed seems to become simpler, but at the same time much deeper, because it is no longer just what is singing or what does singing do, but a broader question about the relationship between a familiar behavior and the way your body functions. And if you go through all the steps we have analyzed, from the mechanical oscillation at the vocal folds, the propagation of vibration in the tissues, the release of nitric oxide, the stimulation of the nervous system through the vagus nerve, the regulation of the autonomic nervous system, the changes in hormones such as cortisol, oxytocin, and endorphins, to the influence on the immune system and the ability to synchronize among many individuals, you begin to see that this seemingly simple action is actually a point of intersection for many different systems in the body. And that makes asking questions about it far more worthwhile than simply viewing it as a form of entertainment. But the important thing I want to keep here is not to turn this entire process into a rigid conclusion, because science, if done correctly, is not about providing final answers, but about understanding the mechanisms more clearly and asking more precise questions. We can see clearly that singing activates a chain of measurable biological responses. We can track each step in that chain, and we can explain why those effects occur. But that does not automatically lead to a command that you must sing, or a conclusion that this is the only factor determining the state of the body. Because the human body is a complex system with many inputs and many ways to reach the same state. However, what we can say is that when a behavior has existed for the vast majority of human history, has been integrated into many different cultures, and at the same time is linked to such a clear chain of biological mechanisms, then removing or reducing that behavior may have consequences that we do not fully understand yet. Not in a dramatic sense, but in an accumulating and subtle sense over time. This brings us to a question that I think is more interesting than any conclusion. If your body is designed to respond to a certain type of stimulus, and you no longer provide that stimulus, then what will your body do instead? Or in what way will it function when missing part of the input it once received regularly? There may be compensatory mechanisms that we do not yet understand. There may be other behaviors that replace part of the function of singing. Or there may also be small gaps that we have not noticed because they do not manifest clearly right away. And all these possibilities are worth considering. Another important point is the way we understand our own subjective experience. Because if you feel relaxed, connected, or comfortable after singing, you may explain it in many different ways. But when you know that there are specific physical and biological mechanisms behind those experiences, you begin to see them as signals from the body rather than random phenomena. And this changes the way you ask questions about your own experience. Instead of asking, why do I feel this way, you can begin to ask, what is my body doing to create that feeling? And that question opens up a different way of looking at the relationship between behavior and physiology. When you look back at this entire journey from a simple observation that humans once sang, more to a chain of mechanisms linking physics, chemistry, and biology, you may see that the world we live in may be more complex than we usually think. Not because it is mysterious, but because we often only see a very small part of what is actually happening. And perhaps the most important thing is not whether you change your behavior or not, but whether you realize that even the most familiar actions can have deeper layers of meaning, and that your body is always responding to the world in ways that you are not always aware of. So I will not end with advice or a definitive conclusion, but only leave you with a thought. If a simple action like singing can activate such a complex chain of responses in the body, then how many other things in your daily life are also doing something similar that you have never really noticed? If you feel that these things make you see the world in a different way, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next discoveries. Thank you for spending your time, and I will see you in the next story.